When trouble comes knocking at the door, spiritual amnesia just seems to set in, doesn't it? It doesn't matter how many scrapes God has pulled me out of. It doesn't matter how often things work out for the good. When I find myself in a crisis, I always manage to forget that God has got things under control. That forgetfulness is the bad news. The good news is I'm in good company. We all develop spiritual amnesia and we hit the panic button when an unexpected crisis enters our lives. And that's just what the Israelites were doing in this morning's reading. Just 2 chapters earlier, we find Moses and the Israelites bursting into a song of thanksgiving after their miraculous crossing of the Red Sea. And although they found themselves in a hostile desert wilderness, God takes care of them by transforming the only available desert water from an undrinkable and bitter-tasting cesspool into thirst-quenching, sweet-tasting water. Shortly after that, they stumbled upon an oasis of 12 springs of water and 70 palm trees. And in the chapter just prior to this morning's reading, God miraculously provides food in the form of quail and bread which literally falls from the sky. Clearly, God has their back. As treacherous as the desert is, God proves over and over that their needs will be met. And yet when the water supply begins to once again run low, the crowd goes into panic mode. It's as if the crossing of the Red Sea, the oasis, the quail, and the supply of bread never happened. Spiritual amnesia has set in for the Israelites. And the temptation when we find ourselves in crisis and we're unable to recall God's faithfulness is to fall into anger and resentment. Our text says the people quarreled and complained against Moses. And that sort of attitude can become contagious if we allow it. Moses seemed to give in to their bitterness when our text says, he cried out to God, "What shall I do with this people?" We see the same thing happening today. When bad things happen in our society, whether it's the rising death toll due to COVID-19 or it's racial violence, whether it's the effects of climate change or it's the worry about elections, we find someone to blame. And then it turns into a feeding frenzy on social media with everyone jumping in for their own taste of the kill. It's almost as if we need someone to blame. And once we find them, we won't rest until the person is totally destroyed. There's something a bit barbaric in that kind of behavior, don't you think? May God save us from the need to blame one another, shout our opinions at one another, or hunt for conspiracy theories to justify our own prejudice. Quarreling and complaining are contagious if we allow them to be so. Not only that, but we can spend so much of our energy complaining we never get around to analyzing the challenge and addressing it. We simply get stuck in our problem and stuck in our state of mind. And that's the danger. The Israelites had become stuck. They were unwilling to go any further, and yet God's response to Moses was, go ahead of the people, to keep moving forward. And if Moses obeyed, he would find a solution. In this case, an unlikely rock that would yield forth water. As long as we are stuck in our attitude of quarreling and complaining, as long as we buy into the lie that God is unable or unwilling to lift us above the problems of life, then we forfeit our power as God's own beloved children. And when we do that, we will constantly be asking the same question that the Israelites asked: is God with us or not? What I find interesting are the names that were given to the place where this desert miracle happened. The names weren't Hebrew versions of saved again or God's providence. Instead, the names given to the place where their thirst was quenched by the water that gushed forth from a rock were Massa and Meribah, which mean test and arguing. They would forever remember that time in their history as a time of testing and arguing rather than as a time of salvation in the desert. But you know what? I'm guilty of the same thing. I tend to remember the 6 days I was down with a head cold instead of how good it felt when I began to get my strength back. I remember the challenging and difficult people that I am so grateful are no longer a part of my life, instead of appreciating the good people who continue to enrich it. I remember my spiritual deserts instead of giving thanks for the oases. And if there's a challenge in this morning's text, I think it's to recall the oasis points in our past, where provision of our needs has carried with it a strong sense of God's presence on the one hand, and on the other hand, to not become so stuck in an attitude of despair that we are unable to look to a future hope that draws us forward. In other words, the cure for my tunnel vision of despair is to remember the oases of my past and to keep moving toward my hope for the future. If I can do that, if I can continue to recall and give thanks for the many blessings in my life, and if I can also continue to believe that God has plans for my welfare and not for harm, for a future with hope, if I can hold those things ever before me, then I will be able to answer an emphatic yes to the question, is God with me or not? God is indeed with us, always has been and always will be. But when it feels as if God isn't, even when it feels as if God has abandoned us, and when there seems to be no evidence of God's presence in our circumstances, we need to resist the temptation to give in to complaint as an ongoing state of mind. Remember that God is compassionate. God didn't allow the Israelites to die of thirst. Their needs were met. There was water in the wilderness, even though it wasn't apparent. God remains compassionate to you and me. There is water in our wildernesses, even though it may not look like it. I was recently reminded of this water in the wilderness by a social media post by Reverend Darrell Watkins that someone somewhere in the world is performing an act of kindness. Somewhere within our country there is a person who decided to be generous for no reason at all. Within our community, someone is displaying monumental courage by simply living their life authentically. And within our congregation, there are people who pray fervently for our country and for those who are in need. These things may not sound like much, but they are the life-giving drink of water that quenches our dry and parched spirits. It's easier said than done, this business of moving past the dry spots in our wildernesses. When we're stuck in a place without water, it's hard to remember the oasis points in our past. And it's just as hard to believe that God's plans for our future are more than just wishful thinking. But with support from each other, we can recall God's care for us in our past, and we can come to believe in God's plans for our future. And if we can do this, we will know that indeed God is with us, and always will be. Amen.